In the area of Coptic monasticism and how Coptic monastic life had influence on Western monasticism. Our guest today is PhD candidate Patricia Eshagh, a PhD candidate at Claremont Graduate University School of Religion, and her research work is on the subject of today. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to speak with you on this important topic.
Thank you for doing the research work in the first place and for talking with us today about it. But I'm very curious first, what attracted you to Coptic studies in general and then to choose this topic? Somebody grown up in California.
It all began with an interest in monasticism. This is a topic that I've been interested in for some time, and I also did a master's thesis on the topic working in the early medieval period. And so when I came to Claremont Graduate University, I came with a background in Western monastic studies, and I was encouraged by my advisor to take a course that was being offered that semester, and that course was with Dr. Gaudat Gabra, and it covered Coptic culture and history. And that was a very interesting course for me to take because I had no prior experience in Coptic studies of any kind. And the more I learned about the subject, the more interested I became. At the end of that course, we took a trip to Egypt in January of 2008. It was the first trip to Egypt by Claremont Graduate University. And it included a group of students and faculty and family members as well. And so we went to Egypt with the idea that we would see some of the things that we had studied in the course by Dr. Gabra. But we were surprised by many special moments on the trip. One of the highlights of the trip was we had an opportunity to visit the papal residence of Pope Shenouda III, just prior to Christmas activities. So the papal residence was a very busy place. We came by bus and we unloaded in front of the residence and were surprised by the throngs of people that were waiting for our arrival. We had television cameras, we had many people, security guards, etc., that all ushered us into the papal residence. And from there, we had the pleasure of visiting with the Pope and actually asking questions of him, which he was very gracious to answer. So that was one of the highlights of the trip. But also for me, as a student of monasticism, we had an opportunity to visit many of the monastic sites in Egypt. We visited several monasteries, including the monastery of St. Macarius. We went by the Red Sea and visited the monasteries of St. Anthony and St. Paul. We traveled to Sinai and visited St. Catherine's Monastery. So having an opportunity to actually be at these places, see these monasteries, visit with the monks who were living there on a day-to-day basis was very moving for me. So when I returned back from the trip to Egypt, I was convinced that I needed to dedicate my studies to Coptic monasticism. And with the help of Dr. Gabra, who became one of my advisors in this journey, we decided to focus on the influence of Coptic monasticism on Western monasticism for my doctoral dissertation. But prior to working on the dissertation itself, I had an opportunity to take several courses at Claremont Graduate University with Dr. Gabra, and they included a course on the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers in Coptic. We actually worked with the sayings in the Coptic language and translated them into English. And then I also took another course that was very, very interesting that was on Coptic literature. And there we studied manuscripts in Coptic once again, looking at Coptic Apocrypha, looking at magic texts, looking at New Testament. And so those opportunities gave me a chance to work in the language itself and also to make use of some of the reference material at Claremont Graduate University, one of which is the Coptic Encyclopedia, which is an enormous source of information on Coptic studies. So having gained the experience of the coursework at Claremont Graduate University, I was then able to begin thinking of the dissertation itself and how I would focus my background in Western monasticism on looking at the influences that came from Egypt, that came from the efforts of the monks in the desert. And so that is basically the journey that I've taken thus far.
Thank you. It's amazing that your trip to Egypt, along with the courses that you studied with Professor Gaudat Gabra on various topics of Coptic studies, attracted you to become, or you're on your way to become an expert as soon as you finish your PhD dissertation and start a career in Coptic studies. I know you taught art history and other topics at California State University, Stanislaus in Northern California.
Yes.
And that, of course, experience in art history and your master's in art history, and then now it led you to Coptic monasticism. How art history and Coptic monasticism, do they have any connection that you can talk with us about it now?
Well, the art history, a lot of art history is based on religion and the artwork that is produced from religion, in particular Christian art. And so within the genre of Christian art, of course, Coptic art plays a very big role. And I try to incorporate that in my lectures because it's not something that's actually taught very much, but because of my background in Coptic studies, I do insert that in my discussions. So we look at the architecture, we look at the textiles and those kinds of elements because they do greatly influence Christian art as a whole, and then the development of Christian art in the West, which leads to certain designs, certain elements that definitely have an effect.
I'm holding in my hand a book, Monastic Visions, edited by Professor Elizabeth Bowman, and Dr. Gaudat Gabra contributed a chapter, and few other people from around the world, including Egypt. And the book really covers a lot of material, including what's called monastic art, wall paintings about Saint Shenouda and other saints. And the visitor of St. Anthony Monastery by the Red Sea can see the revival on the wall paintings from rediscovering and restoration of these monumental icons. And
definitely.
You visited these places, and what's your reflection from such a visit, seeing these icons on the walls and then related later to your studies?
Well, I was taken by the artistic endeavor itself. I was very surprised by how beautiful these paintings were. They're very intricate, they're very involved, and they express an artistic understanding that I was not aware of prior to my visit to the monastery. And Elizabeth Bowman has done a terrific job of publishing these paintings, and through their conservation work has done a great job in getting the message out that the artwork that is contained in these monasteries is really wonderful and needs to be studied further.
Now coming to the influence of Coptic monasticism on Western monasticism, what areas or examples you can give us today? I know it's difficult for PhD students writing their dissertations to divulge information, special results of their research before they publish it. So as much as you can tell us that is available in the open literature.
Sure. Well, it begins with what started the whole process. And for me, I was interested in, yes, transmission, but transmission on a human scale, meaning I was looking for direct contact, direct interrelations between people, looking for ways that ideas could be transferred from one location, which in the case of Egypt, over to Western Europe, as far west as Ireland. So I was looking for ways that this information could be passed. It is obvious through tradition that transmission took place through text, through books, through the copying of books, through the network of creating books. But I was looking for something a little bit more difficult to define, and that is human interaction, face-to-face contact through oral tradition, through other methods to create a link that would definitely show that there was transmission from Egypt to Western Europe in the topic of monasticism, in exchanging ideas, using Egyptian monasticism as a model for the development of monasticism in the West. And so that began by looking at very specific instances where I could locate contact. And the first question that came to my mind was how did people come to the Egyptian desert? What was the attraction to the Egyptian desert? And over the course of the 3rd and 4th century, we find that people chose to go to the desert for various reasons. There's many theories as to why, and some of those theories involve fleeing from persecution. We had Christian persecutions in the 3rd century, in the 4th century. So a lot of times Christians were fleeing for those reasons, trying to get away from being persecuted for their faith. In addition to that, there were other situations. We find that people had opportunities to go to the desert to escape being taxed. For Roman citizens who had some kind of senatorial status, we find that they were fleeing to the desert, taking on the appearance of being a monk to avoid their civic duty. In fact, there is a law that is in the law books of Emperor Theodosius that speaks specifically about monks who are trying to avoid their civic duty and are trying to masquerade as monks, when in fact they are Roman senators. So there's many theories as to why people came to the desert, but the fact is they did come, and they established themselves there in various styles of living, be it the hermit or the anchoritic style of living where they lived by themselves. Some chose to live in what is called a semi-anchoritic lifestyle, where they did come into a communal setting for worship, but otherwise lived apart. And then we have the cenobitic, or the communal type of lifestyle. So you had all these different lifestyles and this attraction to the desert that became publicized. And as I mentioned earlier, it was publicized through books, yes. There were many texts that were produced that shared the stories of what was happening in this setting in Egypt, this spiritual setting. And we know, of course, of the biographies of Antony, of Pachomius, of the Pachomian rule. We have the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers that were later put into book form and then circulated. All of these texts became translated in Latin, which then gave access to the Western European readership. So for them, once those books were translated, then they had access to this information. So there was a wide network of availability to these stories coming out of Egypt. These very interesting stories of some of us, this monastic experiment, if you will, of gathering together and re-identifying themselves in an ascetic sort of way, re-establishing their devotion and their faith. And so these stories being circulated then were a great attraction to readers, especially we know of people in Italy, in Rome, that gained access to this information. Athanasius himself went to Rome twice. Yeah. He was exiled from Egypt, right. Went to Rome and shared Egyptian monasticism that way, one-on-one, meeting with people and sharing his background and his tremendous authority on that subject, having written the biography of Antony. We also have visitors that then decided to come to Egypt to see these desert fathers and mothers personally. And so many gave up their lives, in some cases very rich, wealthy lives, and they came to the desert to visit with the monks. In some cases, they chose to stay. We have many stories that talk about this type of activity. For example, one of the stories that I find very interesting is the story of Melania the Elder. This was a woman who lived in Rome. She was married to an aristocrat, so very wealthy family. She was widowed when she was 22 years old, and shortly thereafter she left Rome and came to Alexandria, then traveled from there to the monastic communities of Nitria and Skades, and she stayed there for 6 months, living amongst the desert fathers, where she learned their monastic lifestyle. And then from there she went to create her own monasteries in Palestine. And it's through her connection that we know that she, one-on-one, once again, with face-to-face contact with individuals, she influenced others to come to Egypt. One of the people that she influenced was Evagrius Ponticus, who we know came to Egypt and lived the rest of his life there, producing wonderful works on monasticism and theology. And he himself then became a master in this lifestyle of Egyptian monasticism, and then trained others after him to follow in those footsteps. And we know, for example, that John Cassian, who is responsible for bringing the Egyptian monastic model to Western Europe, was a disciple of Evagrius Ponticus. And so we have this direct line of training, of sharing of these ideas, face-to-face contact amongst people that we can trace, and that is what I'm doing for my dissertation. I'm writing about this transmission from person to person through discipleship, from master to student and then master to student, transferring this information. And it eventually then, through the efforts of John Cassian, does arrive in France, where he then writes his 2 books that talk about the model of Egyptian monasticism. And then from there, it is shared locally amongst the local bishops there, and then is transferred throughout the world.
Thank you. Just a quick question, because we have only 1 or 2 minutes left. Are these material available in English in Amazon.com under particular
Absolutely.
titles, like what?
Yes, we're fortunate that a lot of the texts are now translated in English. So we have the books written by John Cassian. We have the works of Evagrius Ponticus. We have the desert sayings of the fathers and mothers. All of these materials are readily available in English.
Very good.
And all available on Amazon.com.
Before we conclude, I would like to give a tribute to His Holiness Pope Shenouda III, who in many ways encouraged Coptic studies And just we have listened today to one example, which is receiving a group of 28 people from Claremont Graduate University, both faculty and students and spouses, under the leadership of Dr. Gaudat Gabra, and that was on January 4th, 2008, at the papal residence in Cairo. And he was so generous, he gave them 2 hours. The plan was only half an hour, but he was so generous with them, answering their questions, and they were very curious and asking legitimate and interesting questions that, and took a memorable photograph, which we are showing on the screen now, and we may God bless his soul in heaven. Patricia, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak on this subject, the influence of Coptic monasticism on Western monasticism, and also about your trip to Egypt that, along with courses you took at Claremont Graduate University, has inspired you to choose Coptic studies as a career and also to do your dissertation on the subject.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again. As we conclude this segment, we would like to see you next week for another segment of Logos TV program on Coptic life and civilization. I'm Michael Saad.